we do a lot of this in the rare disease space, and I think there what we try and focus on is the idea that every patient is quite individual, and you want to try and have patient input all along the process of the clinical trial pathway, particularly in the planning stage. Actually, you can learn huge amounts from patients when you're trying to plan a clinical trial protocol and try and appreciate the burden that that protocol will have on them, and this means you can hopefully build a trial which will work better for the patients themselves, and that in turn should increase the compliance on the trial itself. I think there are a lot of things that people can learn from rare diseases because there's that need for the patients themselves to be more engaged from the off. Because it's so hard to find people interested in these diseases, the patients have had to form these groups. Often, you're talking about 20 patients in a country, but they do come together and try and drive things forward. And because of that, my sense is that the rare disease research field is a little bit ahead of some of the other areas of research in patient engagement, in designing new endpoints that are patient-focused, that work for what patients are looking for, in making sure patients have a say and feedback into trials as they're running and after they've run, so people can learn from them there. So I think that's a major area to learn from. The plasticity in the trial design, I think, is a really, really big one as well. It's often very hard to run a clinical trial that might have a randomized control arm, for example, because there are so few patients or the condition is so severe that it would be unethical to deliver that treatment, not to deliver the treatment, sorry. So that means I think often some of the trial designs themselves have been a bit more adaptive in that space, and that could be a great area for some more common disease studies to focus on, to learn from, to see how we can move forward in delivering new trials, and maybe using the evidence generated from those trials to lead to regulation and successful regulation and approval for new drugs. Rare diseases are really challenging because there are so few patients, and because they're really fractured and split around the country, or the world in fact, so it can be very hard to identify them, to recruit them to trials, and that's the main area that everyone worries about, I think. And again, patient groups that can form nationally or internationally can give you access to that network very quickly, and this can really make recruitment a much easier process. But beyond recruitment, there's a whole range of other quite serious challenges. The knowledge about the diseases themselves can be quite limiting, so it's hard to know exactly how the disease should progress, and that makes it very difficult to understand the landmarks or endpoints that you're looking for in a trial. So you often have to do some quite detailed work in advance to really understand what the progress will be and what a valid endpoint will be. And again, we think engaging with the patient groups early can help with that. There's all kinds of other crazy issues that we tend to run across with patients in rare diseases. People just don't really understand the illness. That's the fundamental problem, and actually getting the interest in doing the research initially is a big push. So yeah, I think engaging with the patients early really solves a lot of the problems quite effectively. Delivering the trials can actually be easier sometimes though, and that's because often, especially in Europe, there are specialist centres that treat these rare diseases, so these patients are already going to those centres and are familiar with the clinicians, so that can mean it can be something of an advantage. The patients are used to doing that travel and used to going there to engage with treatment. And they're also really keen and driven to partake in research, because in many cases, unfortunately, they don't have any kind of treatments whatsoever. And this can make them really engaged and keen to actually do the work itself. So I think there are advantages as well as disadvantages that people should consider. The idea of personalised medicine is a really big field and a big area, and again, that almost makes lots of common diseases much rarer. There's a need for trials to become more focused on smaller subpopulations within illnesses with specific genetic mutations, for example, and that's going to mean that trials are going to have to become more effective at recruiting those specific individuals with those mutations, and also working on the smaller patient populations and with some of these more adaptive trial designs. So I think that move towards this personalised genetic medicine will have a huge knock-on effect in the way trials are run in the future, and I do think that's probably going to be something that's really started to come to the fore over the next year or so.